It was almost real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 101. Hello, and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling between the 1860s and 1930. And in this episode, I'll be discussing some of the more dangerous aspects of kayfabe. But first, I have a couple of updates. The first one being that starting with this episode, the podcast will now be a weekly show. So each Monday, we will publish an episode going forward. And I know that my cousin Dan is looking down on me now, cussing and kicking and saying that he tried to convince me to do this for 2 years, which he was right about. But I was always worried that I was not going to be able to keep up with the research, and I'm hopefully optimistic that I will be able to keep up with the research to keep the shows interesting and to provide the historical information that people come to the show to hear. One of the things that I did want to correct actually is some historical information from the past episode. I misspoke because I said that Stecker and Lewis wrestled their last contest in 1919. That was the last contest of their original four-match series. So I knew, because of Lou Thesz's book, Hooker, and some other sources that I had read about the 19 teens, that Stecker and Lewis had engaged in three contests that were all draws before Lewis finally got the best of them. And I thought Lewis got the best of them in the third match, but it was actually the fourth match. So they had a match in Chicago in 1919 that Lewis won. He took one fall out of a best 2 out of 3 fall match, but they had an agreement that if either one scored a fall after 2 hours had expired, that the other one would be the winner of the match. And I think they wrestled the full 3 hours before Lewis was declared the winner, but he won their fourth contest. And then in 1928, he won the unification match in St. Louis, which was actually their last contest. They had 5 contests, and they worked a handful of other matches. The 5 contests they wrestled were deadly dull. And that is why I've always said that if professional wrestling had not evolved into a worked sport, it would have never been popular with spectators. So if you've ever seen a submission wrestling match or an amateur wrestling match, so imagine an amateur wrestling match where they can get submissions. That's why I think submission wrestling is the more comparable sport. But imagine matches that go 2, 3, and there was a 7-hour draw between William Muldoon and Clarence Whistler, which was a Greco-Roman match. So if you think a catch as catch can match can be boring, you've yet seen anything till you see two guys in an upper body tie up for 7 hours, not doing anything. And how the wrestling started becoming a work was not because they wanted to make it more exciting. It was a work because they were taking part in gambling schemes, and they were basically bilking the customers. They realized, though, while they were doing these matches, that the matches that they were working for the benefit of maximizing their gambling winnings were also much more popular with the fans than the legitimate contests that they were having. And I think that was one of the big reasons why it starts to become a work sport. That, and when the promotional system develops in the 19 teens, the promoters were always going to want to control the world title. So it was almost destined that it would become a work sport at that point. One of the things I'm woefully behind on, unfortunately, is my email. And there were 2 emails in particular. One, I received one from longtime listener Shannon, who was talking about the Bronco Nagurski episode. He said he wondered if no one tried to shoot on Nagurski or take liberties with him because he might have just been a great fighter, like Mang. Mang was not a hooker or even a shooter, but Mang was not anybody would mess with, nor was Harley Race. So that's quite possible because for that time, Nagurski was definitely bigger and stronger than most human beings walking around. So it was could very well have been the fact that he was just a big, strong guy that nobody wanted to mess with because they didn't know how that situation was going to come out, and they weren't going to try to mess with him if that situation wasn't going to come out in their favor. And then the other email I received, unfortunately, I got not long after Dan had passed away, and I was very busy for those next few months, and I never responded to it. And this is from a professor doing a history project on African American champions before civil rights. And he was inquiring about Jack Claiborne, who, full disclosure, I have written about, and he's from Oberlin, Missouri, so there's some local interest there as well. But I have not really dug into his career, and so I was going to need to do some research before I got back to him. And the summer got away from me, and I unfortunately I never got back to it. So we are going to have an episode about Jack Claiborne here in the future. I'm going to do the research, and then I'm going to send him the link to that uh, podcast episode that will hopefully answer the questions he had and help him with his research because I think that that is an excellent project, and I would like to do anything that I could to help it along. I just wish I had known more at that time and that it hadn't occurred at such an opportune point for me, unfortunately, personally. I think I'm going to save my commentary for a lot of the modern stuff for the end of the podcast. So those who are not fans of the current product don't have to listen to me talk about some of the things that are in the news. I think I'm going to skip the review this week. The main content is about three instances where kayfabe hurt the people involved in the ring in some way. And so the very first one was one that's normally outside of the time period that I study, but I just got interested listening to one of the podcasts about the wrestler Laverne Baxter. I knew almost nothing about him. And so I had very limited knowledge of him. And so just to get more information about him, I started researching him. And one of the very first articles I came across was when he was a 21-year-old rookie in 1940. Baxter wrestled as a heel, and he was wrestling in this Oregon match against, I don't even think the opponent's named. No, the opponent's not even named. Baxter is 225 pounds, and he's billed from Monroe, Oregon. That's not where he was originally from. On Friday night, March 1st, 1940, he's having a match. Well, being a villain, he decides, well, we're going to spice this match up a little bit. And he pushes and kicks John Stevens, the referee, who's 50 years old. Steven promptly dies on the mat. So Baxter pushes and kicks him, and Stevens doesn't get up. And then everybody realizes, oh, there's an issue here. So the medical people get in the ring, and they realize he's already dead. They take him from the ring, and the police arrest Laverne Baxter for murder. Getting arrested for murder is very unusual, but getting arrested after a wrestling match is not as unusual as you would think. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the second instance I'm going to discuss. But what had happened is something that happened. Most deaths in professional wrestling in the wrestling ring are not from moves gone wrong. There's, I think, maybe one or two, maybe three cases of that. But most of the deaths in professional wrestling have not been from botched moves. They have been from people having massive heart attacks in the ring and dying. The coroner's jury for this case would reveal that that's exactly what happened here. The examining physician explained to the coroner's jury that John Stevens had a pretty advanced case of heart disease, and that he could have had a massive heart attack at any time, and that the action in the ring really did not contribute to his death at all. So the case was dismissed against Laverne Baxter. The coroner ruled that it was just a death from natural causes. Baxter would wrestle for about 20 years, and then he would retire to Wilmington, Delaware, and he would open a car dealership in his early 40s. And unfortunately, after a short illness, Baxter would pass away at only 51 years of age. The second instance is one I was much more familiar with, and that is the match in St. Louis on Memorial Day 1925 when Joe Stecker defeated Stanislav Zbyszko for the World Heavyweight Wrestling Championship that Zbyszko had taken from Big Wayne Munn in a shoot just a month prior to that in April in Philadelphia. And this was a worked match. Zbyszko was dropping the title to Stecker. It was all part of the planned double cross of the Goldust Trio. And during the match, Stecker picks Zbyszko up for a slam. And I don't know if Zbyszko was kind of off balance and Stecker was off balance, but whatever happened, I don't think Stecker dropped him, but they were unbalanced enough that Zbyszko fell awkwardly when he took the slam. At first they thought it dislocated his shoulder, but it actually had just damaged some ligaments in the shoulder. And Zbyszko was pinned pretty quickly after that. I think that they just decided, well, we're going to end it right now before he took any more damage. But the St. Louis police arrested Joe Stecker and charged him with felony assault. And the prosecutor was actually going to bring charges against Stecker for deliberately injuring Zbyszko. Zbyszko, of course, didn't let that happen. He went to the prosecutor and said, no, no, because they arrested him the day of the match. They were going to charge him the next day. And Zbyszko actually did spend some time in the hospital. I don't think he spent overnight, but he did get some treatment in the hospital. And then when he went back to his room at the Statler Hotel, and when they tell him the next day that they're going to charge Stecker with felony assault, he goes down to the prosecutor's office and says, no, 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 it was as much my fault as his. I was trying to resist the slam, and we both came down in an awkward way. Because Stanislav Zbyszko really can't go in and tell the prosecutor, no, no, I'm working this match with my friend here. We had double crossed the most dominant faction in professional wrestling, and now I'm dropping the title to him so he can be the world champion because they've frozen him and my younger brother out of the world championship picture for the last 3 years. That would, of course, have gone over like a lead balloon and made every newspaper in the country. So he had to go in and vouch, no, this was not on purpose, and I was as much to blame as Joe Stecker. He beat me fair and square for the World Heavyweight Wrestling Championship. Again, the promoters in that did not smarten up the police or the city officials in that for the most part. I've heard that there were some police officers that were fairly regularly assigned to protect the wrestlers at the wrestling matches, and they would kind of figure out what was going on. But as a rule, you smartened up as few people as humanly possible because you did not want people to expose the business. The more people that know and are in on it, the more potential you have for professional wrestling to be exposed as a work sport. I will say it's probably good that Vince came out when he did, when he had said that wrestling was worked, and all the promoters in that and the wrestlers, you know, they a long time harbored ill will towards Vince McMahon. But I think if Vince hadn't exposed it in the 80s because he didn't want to pay tax to the governing bodies, I think it would have been exposed today because everybody's on social media with everything. That's why I think all conspiracy theories are nonsense. No one can keep their mouth closed today. To have a conspiracy, you've got to have people keep their mouth shut about what's going on. And since no one is capable of doing that, You do not have that ability today to have a conspiracy because it's going to be let out of the bag on probably on social media within about 5 minutes of you deciding that that's what everybody's going to do. And the last instance of kayfabe kind of going a little bit wrong occurred in 1936. In this match, Mike Romano, who was a big wrestling star, nationally known wrestling star in the 1920s, friends with Joseph Tootsmont, is wrestling in Washington, D.C., and he is in his very early, no, he's 40. I thought he was in his early 40s. Oh, no, that was what the controversy was. Some sources have him as 40 years old in 1936. Other sources have him as 46 years old in 1936. So he is in his 40s in 1936, and he is wrestling a match with Irish Jack Donovan in front of about 5,000 wrestling fans in D.C. And Romano was putting over Donovan in this worked match, and they had only wrestled for about 5 or 7 minutes when Donovan uh, is getting ready to apply a head scissors, and all of a sudden Romano just arches his back in a really unusual manner and tries to balance himself, but his legs will not respond at all. And it was so bad, a woman at ringside had yelled, "That man is really hurt. Look at his face." And Romano's face was distorted and his eyes were bulging right before he went limp. So that was almost assuredly when he was actually having his heart attack. Donovan released a hold immediately, and the referee, whose name was Cyclone Burns, reacted very quickly and raised Donovan's hand and starts yelling for the medical people to get in the ring. The fans didn't realize what happened at first, so they start booing. So you've got 5,000 fans booing a dead man and don't even realize it. And they cheered the decision, but then they booed Romano for not getting up off the mat. When the officials start coming in the ring, then the fans realize, oh, wait a minute, something's drastically wrong. That this is not planned. There's a picture in the I think it was the uh, Washington Herald of them carrying Romano out on a stretcher, and he never regains consciousness. He died right there in the ring, and the police arrest not only Irish Jack Donovan, they arrest the referee Cyclone Burns too. Hard to tell what Cyclone Burns did to get arrested, but they arrested both guys for murdering Mike Romano. In this case, unlike in St. Louis, pretty quickly the officials realized that nothing that the wrestler or the referee did contributed in any way to Mike Romano's death, and they were released right away. The coroner's inquest was held either the next day or the day after that, and the physician who had examined Mike Romano's body said he had an advanced stage of heart disease that you usually see in someone 20 years older, and that, again, he was a ticking time bomb. It was only a matter of time, and anything actually could have caused him to have a heart attack. The exertion that he was doing as a professional wrestler definitely was not helping, but that he was definitely going to have a heart attack in the very near future. Mike Romano's death would kind of reverberate for a couple years after that because I had said earlier Romano was friends with Joseph Tootsmont, and when Tootsmont was running his own champion, Romano gave Mont one of his old title belts to use for his champion. Well, after he died, his widow needs to make sure that she can provide for herself and their two children. And so she wants this belt back from Tootsmont or give her the money for it because Romano had told her it was worth, $1,000, $2,000. And Joseph Tootsmont, being the natural born heel that he was, filed papers on the widow saying, well, it's just a belt, it does have some diamonds and rubies in it, but it probably isn't worth that much. Well, the courts sided with Mrs. Romano and not with Joseph Toots Mott. And I think he did end up finally just paying her for the belt. She didn't really need the belt. She wanted the money for the belt. So she was either going to get it for Toots Mott or she would sell it to some other wrestling promoter. So I think Toots finally, probably very begrudgingly, probably tried to make a deal with her before he turned the money over. But he would make a deal with her over that belt, I believe. Tragic, I mean, 40 or 46. That's way too young to be dying of a heart attack. That's it for the main content for this week. I did want to, for the listeners who've not heard the story before, I started blogging in 2013, and I had originally started blogging just to capture the family history for my mother and my Aunt Willa. So my Aunt Willa was one of the family members on the Zimmerman side, or my natural father's side, who I was close to, and she was the family history historian before me. And so I wanted to capture the family history for both of them. And I had heard about this thing called blogging. And so I had started a blog originally on Blogger, and then I went on to WordPress and paid for my own site. And I always loved St. Louis history, and I was always interested in researching St. Louis history. Besides recording the family history, I started writing about St. Louis history and classic Hollywood films and all kinds of other stuff as well. I was kind of all over the map for the first 3 or 4 years I was blogging. And the first 3 or 4 years, I probably put out a post daily, at least Monday through Friday. As I continued blogging, and 6 months into the blogging, I started researching professional wrestling and professional boxing. As I had always been interested in professional wrestling at a time that I thought most of the wrestling was legitimate. And I thought that that was around I knew that by the 20s, there had to be work matches because I knew about the double cross. I knew about Stanislav Zbyszko shooting on Wayne Big Mun and defeating him for real. I did not realize when I started researching that there were work matches as long as there's been professional wrestling in the United States. That's not to say that all of the matches prior to 1915 were worked. In the 19th century, a lot to the majority were contests. But you have worked wrestling matches primarily to support the gambling schemes of the ring that was putting the match on, going back to the 1860s. As I started writing books and I captured what I thought was all the family history, I quit writing about family history as much. I eventually quit writing about film as much and really started to focus on combat sports history and St. Louis history. And then eventually, I really just focused on combat sports history. But I was still putting out a blog post about once a week. In 2021, I was on the Martial Culture podcast. I really enjoyed the experience with Coach Renee. And it started me thinking about having a podcast of my own. I actually had a failed experiment with podcasting in 2016 that, much like my website, my podcast was all over the place. And I talked about every kind of different topic you could think of. And there was no real focus to it. And when I started thinking about doing a podcast in 2022, I said, this one's going to have a focus to it. I may occasionally talk about something else, but this one's going to have a focus to it. And so that focus was going to be on combat sports and on professional wrestling in particular. And then as the more I thought about it, the vast majority of my writing is about professional wrestling. So I'm going to make it almost exclusively professional wrestling. We may touch on MMA every once in a while. We may touch on classic boxing every once in a while. But this is going to be a pro wrestling history podcast. And so then I had to come up with a name for it. I would have loved to go with the name It Was Real. But as I've said, from all the time periods I have studied, I've always found work matches in every single time period. And that's when I came up with It Was Almost Real. Some of them are real, Some of them were worked, so it was almost real. And I initially intended to do it once a month, and then I thought, no, that's not close to being enough. So I was going to do two podcasts enough because there's a lot of research that goes into each episode, and I wanted to be able to keep up with that. Just by accident, because I needed to record an episode because I was putting out two episodes a month, I took the microphone with me down to Scott City when I was helping my cousin Dan clean out his mom's house so that he could move back to St. Louis. He had always intended, when that day came when Aunt Willa unfortunately passed away in 2022, that he would move back to St. Louis. So the first episode, he was just kind of an accidental guest. I had started doing the podcast with my son Caleb because I like to have somebody to bounce stuff off during the podcast. But Dan was an accidental guest, but he and I have always had chemistry. The episode I thought was pretty good. So then he joined Caleb and I when he came up for Thanksgiving. And then for Thanksgiving. And then from that point on, he was a regular on the podcast. And when he moved to St. Louis in the summer of 2023, he and I did most of the podcast. Trey and Caleb would join us occasionally, but it was mostly me and Dan. And I would do legs on Sunday because I like to start the week out with the hardest workout. And I would drive over to his house after the workout, eat breakfast. He and I would do the podcast, and then we'd settle in and watch professional football for the day. And he kept wanting me to go weekly. And I kept pushing back on that. I'm like, Dan, you know how much research goes into this? You just sit there and make funny asides and take the piss out of people. I actually have to do the research on these topics. And yeah, I've got a lot of it, but I just don't want to regurgitate the things I've written about. I want to be adding new information to that and trying to make the stories interesting or entertaining. And so he always kept pushing me and kept pushing me. So we were doing 3, sometimes 4 a month. I think in December of 2023, we released one every week. And then in February of 2024, Dan got sick and he went into the hospital. And then for the next 15 months, he was between the hospital and the SNF. He came home for a grand total of 3 days during that time. And I did my best to schedule them where he could be on them with me, but because there was loud equipment in his room sometimes, because there was a lot of crazy stuff going on when he was in the sniffs that you could hear and pick up on the background, he and I couldn't do nearly as many episodes as I had wanted. After Dan passed in April, I think I was still doing 2 a month. And I started doing just a couple more because it was kind of cathartic. It kind of reminded me of our time together doing these. And the boys had told me, you really need to think about doing this weekly, Dad. You've got enough material. You don't think you do, but you do. And so, because I've received so much positive feedback on the podcast, I decided to take this weekly. Taking this weekly, I am going to blog or write posts a lot less. I just released my last one for this year last week on Monday, September 22nd. And that post is about the last match my sister Vicky and I attended, which I will probably talk about in a future episode. I'm 99.9% sure this is the last episode that we went, or the last show in St. Louis that we went to because of who was on the card. And I had that program. I'm pretty positive that that's the last one she and I attended, which is like 2 years before I thought it was the last one that I attended. And one of the podcasts this week I was listening to was the Stick to Wrestling podcast with John McAdams. And they were talking about St. Louis, and they were talking about how the WrestlingData.com, which is a fantastic website, has results for St. Louis from 1940 to 1985. Actually, the reason it stops in 1985, St. Louis Wrestling Club continued operating for another year and a half. They didn't stop operating until the end of 1986 when Bob Geigel and Pat O'Connor sold out Central States and St. Louis to Jim Crockett Promotions, which was a lousy deal for Jim Crockett Promotions because basically all they got was some TV time slots. They didn't really get anything else out of that deal. The promotion ran for another year and a half, but the wrestling was so bad and the crowds were getting so small at Kiel Auditorium that the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, who had carried results for the Friday night wrestling shows for 40 plus years, quit carrying those results in the middle of 1985. They would still have the advertisements in the newspaper with what the cards were, but you could no longer go to the Saturday or Sunday editions of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch because they would carry the results for 2 days. After the Friday card, the results would be in Saturday's paper, the results would be in Sunday's paper. The cards were so bad in comparison to what it had been, and the crowds were getting so small. There was a couple cards in 1985. They drew 4,000 fans to the Kiel Auditorium. For the Kiel cards, Sam Muchnick, I don't think ever drew less than 9,000 fans, and it was always upper 9,000s, sometimes around the 10,000 mark if the fire marshal was half asleep. When they went to the Checkerdome for the Checkerdome cards, which was once or twice a year, they'd have 19 to 20,000 people at those cards. I'm going to recommend two wrestling matches that I'm going to actually talk about next week. And these are two wrestling matches starring Hans Schmidt, who was the top heel in the United States in the 1950s because he was the top heel in the Chicago area. The two matches I'm going to recommend are Hans Schmidt versus Lou Newman, which is two heels really versus each other. And then the other match is Hans Schmidt versus United States champion Vern Gagne, which is a match between the top heel in Chicago versus the top babyface in Chicago. So check out both of those matches and we'll discuss them next week. So what I wanted to lead off with in the news, the first thing is the WWE is pricing itself out of the family market. And I was never a fan of what Endeavor did with UFC, and now TKO is following that same pattern or flywheel, as Endeavor's president said so annoyingly during that press conference when they bought WWE. Mark Shapiro, who is the head mucky muck of TKO, I think his official title is chairman, but who cares, did what I thought was virtually impossible, and that's he kind of made Vince look like a good guy for 5 minutes because he said in a call that has been published everywhere that, yeah, Vince was trying to price this thing for families, but he wasn't really maximizing the revenue that he could make off the company. And we're going to do that. So we're going to price it, out of most families' budgets with these VIP packages. And what these VIP packages allow you to do is spend a lot of money to spend a lot more money. If that's your thing, and if it's successful for them, I guess great. I think that it really stands a tremendous chance, though, of blowing right up in their face because one of the things that has helped professional wrestling survive, and it's amazing that it survived as long as it has and how it has, is because of the nostalgic feeling you get when you and your family are watching these shows. I have said one of the reasons I was a big fan was because my sister Vicky watched, and she and I watched together, and we went to the wrestling matches together. Then my two younger sisters, Sherry and Beck, they became wrestling fans. And so we watched all through the 80s and the 90s during the Monday Night Wars. We all watched together. I have to admit, I tapped out on wrestling in the 2000s. I think Beck tapped out around the same time. But Cher and my brother-in-law Ron were still big fans. And their kids are fans today because they grew up watching these premium live events back when they were called pay-per-views with their mom and dad and their mom and dad's friends that would come over and watching that. That is one of the things that has helped keep wrestling alive still. when you start pricing it out of the family's purview, and now it's just going to be for people who have more money to go and see this, you are playing to a smaller audience, and wrestling's already playing to a much smaller audience than it ever did in the past. So I don't know if this in the long run will be a good thing or a bad thing. You can't really knock TKO for its ability to make money because they're making money hand over fist. You just wonder, are they going to do something that makes a big mistake and cost them? The LA police finally arrested Raja Jackson almost a month after the assault. That, it was a month-long investigation of everything that was captured on video that everybody in the world had saw within 3 days of it happening. I expect that with a good attorney, Raja will probably do shock jail or prison time and then have some mandatory counseling or diversion. But who knows? You never know what's going to happen with this. The one thing he's going to have, I'm sure, that's going to help him quite a bit is he's going to have a very good attorney. He will not go to prison for 10 years, but I don't think that there's any way he's going to escape jail or prison time on this. I could be surprised, but I think that even if they kind of set him up for some kind of diversionary program, he's still going to do some jail or prison time because of the brutality of that assault. On something more positive, I am really enjoying these AAA cards, and I guess I'm not the only one because WWE and AAA reported a record crowd of over 770,000 fans watched the AAA Worlds Collide event from Las Vegas in September of 2025. And on this card, so this is going to be a spoiler. If you've not seen this card and you want to go watch it, stop it here, run and go watch the event, and then come back because I'm going to talk about at least one of the results from that event. And that is Dominic Mysterio winning the AAA Mega Championship. I think it's a testament to how much Dom has improved over the past 3 years that he was given the opportunity to be the AAA Mega Champion. And when Rey Mysterio said he'd put the belt on the winner, even Dom if he won it, I thought, are they actually going to let Dom win this thing? And sure enough, they sure did. One of the things driving this, though, is they really needed to make a title switch to get the heat off Vikingo, AAA's long-term babyface star. So Vikingo, who's 28 years old, very talented in the ring, and has actually been a fan favorite. If you've watched the last two AAA events that were on YouTube, he is getting booed out of the building. But he's not getting booed out of the building for anything he's done. He's getting booed out of the building because the fans know that WWE wants nothing to do with Alberto El Patron, and that's why they took the title off of El Patron and put it on. His real name is El Hijo del Vikingo. His father was Vikingo, a big star in Mexico. And his son, El Hijo del Vikingo, is a really talented and is their top babyface. And when he won the title, initially, because I watched the match, the fans cheered that. It was only later, after the fans learned that WWE wanted nothing to do with Alberto El Patron, and that's why they made the title switch, that the fans turned on Vikingo. And it's really not fair. He didn't do anything other than be the guy they selected to carry the title. Part of it is, I don't think the fans like that a company based in the United States is dictating what the Mexican company is going to do. One of the YouTubers had said the reason that they're booing Vikingo is because the fans in Mexico idolize Alberto El Patron. Well, I'm not so sure about that because the fans did cheer Vikingo when he initially won the title, and a couple of weeks or month or two before that, Alberto El Patron had been suspended in Tijuana because he went out into the crowd after somebody who was heckling him, and another fan who was not the one that was heckling him spiked a chair off of his head. and almost caused a riot. I don't think that the idol of millions is somebody who somebody's going to, the average fan is going to spike a chair off their head. So I'm not sure that I agree with that analysis. So Vikingo is getting booed out of the building. So they've got to get the title off him because they don't want him to be ruined. He's their biggest baby face and he is their star of the future. Meanwhile, Dom's getting cheered. This Dirty Dom, this bad guy that everybody loves, because it's happened in the United States too. People can see how hard he's worked, how much he's tried to improve, and Dom has become a favorite. He was cheered by the vast majority of the fans at WrestleMania when he won that Intercontinental Championship. So in this match, which was a pretty good match, Dom wins the AAA Mega Champion. I don't think he's their long-term solution. I don't think he's going to hold it for a couple of years, but I think he's going to serve a dual purpose of one, this is going to get Dom over even more, and he's already over with the fans in both Mexico and America. And it's going to take some of that heat off of Vikingo that he shouldn't be getting for decisions that are outside of his control and that he has no control over. I think I may end it with that piece of news. The next episode, the main content is going to be about a 19th century wrestling topic. I just haven't decided which one. We've been covering collar and elbow, so I'm probably going to bounce back to Greco-Roman or catch wrestling. But we will revisit the collar and elbow as I learn more about that group and how pervasive their influence was in wrestling at the time. So that'll be it for this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. KenZimmermanJr.com is the place to check out the show notes for today's episode. You can view the show notes for the episode at KenZimmermanJr.com, episode 101, slash episode 101, I should say. You can also see what I'm working on currently in the list of books I've written if you're interested in digging deeper into this era of professional wrestling. Thank you for listening today. And I would also be grateful if you would rate this podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to the show. That helps tremendously with keeping the podcast visible so people who have never heard of it can discover it. If you have already done this, thank you so much. Until next time, everybody, take care. Bye-bye.